For nearly 800 years, the most powerful civilization on Earth fought a war against a piece of clothing and lost. Not a war against an enemy army, not a rebellion, not an invading empire. A war against pants. Imagine living in a society so convinced of its own superiority that covering your legs could make people question your loyalty, your intelligence, even your humanity. In ancient Rome, that wasn't an exaggeration. There were periods when wearing trousers could mark you as a foreigner, a barbarian, an outsider who threatened everything Rome claimed to represent. Yet here is the strange twist history loves to deliver. The very clothing Romans mocked eventually conquered Rome itself. Today, almost every person watching this video is dressed like the people Romans spent centuries insulting. And that raises a fascinating question. How does an empire famous for engineering marvels, military discipline, and legal innovation become so blind to something obviously useful? Because the story of Roman pants is not really about fashion. It is about identity. It is about pride. It is about the dangerous moment when a society begins confusing tradition with truth. The Romans built roads across continents, constructed aqueducts that still inspire engineers, and developed legal systems that influenced modern governments. Yet many of those same people looked at a practical pair of trousers and saw a threat to civilization itself. That sounds ridiculous today, but before we laugh too hard, it is worth asking how many of our own beliefs are built on the same foundation. Throughout history, powerful societies have often convinced themselves that their customs were not merely preferences but proof of superiority. Food, language, hairstyles, architecture, religion, even the way people walked became symbols in larger cultural battles. Rome was no different. To understand why Romans hated pants so passionately, we first need to understand something deeper about the Roman mind. Rome wasn't just a country. It was an identity project. Romans genuinely believed they represented order in a chaotic world, civilization against savagery, law against disorder, discipline against chaos. And because identities require boundaries, they needed visible symbols that separated us from them. Clothing became one of the most powerful of those symbols. A Roman citizen could be recognized instantly, not because of his face, but because of what he wore. And among all the garments in Roman society, none carried more meaning than the toga. Ironically, the very garment designed to prove Rome's greatness would eventually help reveal its greatest weakness. Because while Rome was busy protecting symbols, the world around it was changing. And history has a habit of punishing civilizations that mistake appearances for reality. The toga may be the most successful status symbol in human history, because its greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It was spectacularly impractical. Modern people often imagine ancient Romans casually strolling through the city wrapped in elegant white fabric, but that image hides a remarkable truth. The toga was not designed to make life easier. It was designed to make a statement. Imagine carrying 15 to 20 pounds of wool draped around your body every time you left the house. Imagine needing assistance just to get dressed correctly. Imagine being unable to run, work, or even move too quickly without risking public embarrassment. To us, that sounds absurd. To a Roman aristocrat, it sounded perfect, because the toga wasn't clothing in the modern sense. It was a public performance. Every fold communicated status. Every movement signaled privilege. The fact that it restricted physical labor was not a flaw. It was proof that you didn't need to perform physical labor. A wealthy Roman could essentially announce without speaking a word that other people worked so he didn't have to. In many ways, the toga functioned like a luxury sports car in a crowded city. It wasn't optimized for practicality. It was optimized for visibility. And visibility mattered enormously in Roman society. Public life was everything. Elections happened in public. Court cases happened in public. Religious ceremonies happened in public. Political careers were built through public appearances. The forum wasn't merely a marketplace, it was a stage. Roman politicians learned how to use their clothing the same way modern politicians learn camera angles. They practiced gestures. They mastered posture. They understood how dramatic fabric movement could amplify authority. The toga transformed a man into a symbol, but symbols come with a hidden cost. The more important a symbol becomes, the more difficult it becomes to change. And that creates a trap. Because while Roman elites were perfecting the art of looking Roman, most actual Romans were living very different lives. Farmers couldn't harvest crops in a toga. Craftsmen couldn't build houses in a toga. Merchants couldn't load cargo in a toga. Soldiers certainly couldn't fight effectively in one. In reality, the vast majority of people spent most of their lives wearing simple tunics. Easy to make, easy to wear, easy to repair. The toga existed primarily as a ceremonial identity marker, and that distinction matters because it reveals something fascinating about human societies. Often the things we celebrate most loudly are not the things that make us successful. They are the things that make us feel special. Rome's roads created prosperity. Its military secured borders. Its engineers delivered water. But the toga created a story Romans told themselves about who they were. And stories can become surprisingly powerful enough to shape laws, powerful enough to shape politics, powerful enough to convince millions of people that a practical solution is somehow a threat. Yet while senators practiced elegant toga draping in Rome, something very different was happening hundreds of miles away on the empire's frozen frontiers. Out there, survival mattered more than symbolism. And winter has a way of exposing ideas that only work in comfortable climates. If Rome's hatred of pants had been based purely on fashion, the story would have ended quickly. Trends come and go, styles change, people adapt, but this wasn't about fashion at all. It was about geography. More specifically, it was about what happens when a civilization built around Mediterranean sunshine suddenly finds itself ruling territories where winter seems personally offended by human existence. Picture a Roman soldier stationed along the Rhine frontier. He's thousands of miles from the warm climate that shaped Roman culture. The landscape around him is covered in snow. The wind cuts through layers of wool. Temperatures plunge far below anything experienced by most citizens back in Rome. Across the frontier stand Germanic tribes wearing trousers, boots, and layered clothing specifically designed for cold weather. The Romans looked at those outfits and saw barbarism. The barbarians looked at Roman clothing and probably wondered whether the empire had collectively lost its mind. This is where history becomes unexpectedly funny, because nature is the ultimate fact-checker. Political speeches don't matter to winter. Cultural pride doesn't matter to frostbite. Ideology doesn't warm your legs when temperatures fall below freezing. Reality has a way of forcing difficult conversations. At first, Roman soldiers tried to maintain tradition. They wrapped extra cloth around their legs. They improvised solutions. They followed regulations. But regulations written in comfortable offices often look different when you're standing guard in a snowstorm. Gradually, practical necessity began winning battles that Roman philosophers had already declared impossible. Soldiers started borrowing ideas from local populations. Leather leg wrappings appeared. Additional layers appeared. Then eventually, the unthinkable happened. Some Roman troops began wearing trousers, not because they suddenly admired foreign cultures, not because they wanted to rebel, because they wanted to keep functioning. This pattern appears throughout history. Humans rarely abandon long-held beliefs because someone presents a convincing argument. More often, they abandon them because reality becomes impossible to ignore. The frontier exposed a weakness hidden inside Roman cultural confidence. The empire had become so successful that many of its leaders assumed their customs were universally superior. Yet superiority often depends on circumstances. A toga might symbolize status in Rome. It becomes a liability in a German winter. A Roman road might be superior to local paths. Roman clothing wasn't necessarily superior to local clothing. Context changes everything. And that lesson proved difficult for Rome to accept because empires thrive on certainty. Their authority depends on projecting confidence. Admitting that foreigners might have better solutions to certain problems feels dangerously close to admitting vulnerability. But here's the irony. Truly strong civilizations often borrow ideas without fear. They adapt. They learn. They absorb useful innovations regardless of where they originate. Weak civilizations, on the other hand, become obsessed with defending symbols. The Roman frontier became a testing ground for that distinction. Out there, soldiers discovered something revolutionary. The people Rome called barbarians weren't always wrong. Sometimes they had simply solved different problems. And once that realization enters a society, it becomes very difficult to contain. Because if barbarians were right about pants, what else might they be right about? Back in Rome, however, the political class wasn't asking whether trousers worked. They were asking a far more dangerous question. What happens if people stop believing Roman customs are special? And that distinction changed everything. Because once an idea becomes tied to identity, evidence stops being the main factor. Think about it. Nobody in Rome was conducting objective studies comparing cold weather clothing efficiency. Nobody was measuring heat retention. Nobody was publishing reports titled Unexpected Benefits of Leg Coverings Among Northern Populations. The debate had already moved beyond practicality. Pants had become symbolic. To conservative Romans, they represented foreign influence creeping into the empire one stitch at a time. This fear wasn't entirely irrational. Throughout history, cultural changes often arrive disguised as small things. New foods, new words, new technologies, new fashions. At first they seem harmless. Then suddenly entire ways of life begin shifting around them. Roman leaders understood that symbols shape behavior. What they failed to understand was that useful symbols are much harder to stop than useless ones. As trade expanded across Europe and Asia, merchants moved constantly between cultures. They brought spices, metals, textiles, ideas, and clothing styles with them. A trader returning from distant provinces might arrive wearing garments that would have scandalized traditional Romans a century earlier. Yet the world kept turning. Business continued. Wealth flowed. Practicality quietly accumulated allies. What fascinates me most is how familiar this pattern feels. Every generation believes it is defending timeless traditions, when in reality many traditions are simply old innovations that survived. The Romans defending the toga probably imagined themselves preserving ancient values, but centuries before them, the toga itself had evolved from earlier clothing styles. Everything changes eventually. The only question is whether societies adapt gracefully or fight reality every step of the way. Rome increasingly chose the second option. Politicians gave speeches about preserving Roman identity. Writers mocked foreign fashions. Cultural gatekeepers warned that adopting barbarian customs would lead to moral decline. If that sounds familiar, it should. Nearly every civilization in history has produced some version of this argument. New music will destroy society. New technology will destroy society. New fashions will destroy society. New generations will destroy society. Somehow civilization survives anyway. Yet beneath the rhetoric, ordinary people were making practical decisions. A merchant who traveled north preferred clothing that worked in northern climates. A soldier stationed on distant frontiers preferred clothing that improved mobility. A traveler crossing difficult terrain preferred comfort over symbolism. Every individual decision seemed small. Together they formed a cultural tidal wave. And here's the truly fascinating part. Rome's leaders could see the change happening. They knew people were adopting foreign styles. They knew traditional dress was becoming less dominant. But instead of asking why, many doubled down on defending the symbol itself. History repeatedly shows that when leaders spend more energy protecting appearances than solving problems, they are often fighting a battle they have already lost. Rome was approaching that moment. The empire still looked powerful. The institutions still functioned. The ceremonies still impressed. But underneath the surface, the old certainty was beginning to crack. And once certainty starts cracking, change accelerates faster than anyone expects. Then came the moment every declining tradition eventually faces, the point where persuasion no longer works, so authority reaches for law. By the late Roman Empire, trousers had become common enough that the government felt compelled to intervene, and whenever a government starts legislating fashion, it usually reveals less about clothing and more about anxiety. Rome was anxious. Not because pants were dangerous, but because they symbolized a loss of control. For centuries, Roman identity had been reinforced through visible markers. Citizens looked Roman, senators looked Roman, soldiers looked Roman. The empire projected a unified image, but images become harder to maintain when the population grows more diverse, trade expands, and cultural boundaries blur. Suddenly people were mixing customs, languages, and fashions in ways earlier generations would barely recognize. To conservative elites, trousers became a convenient target. They could point to them and say, "There, that's the problem." It is much easier to blame a visible symbol than confront deeper transformations. Yet history rarely cooperates with that strategy. The more authorities tried to define what counted as truly Roman, the harder it became to enforce. Consider the challenge. Rome was no longer a compact Mediterranean city-state. It was an enormous multicultural empire stretching across continents. Millions of people lived under Roman rule. Many spoke different languages. Many practiced different traditions. Many had never seen the city of Rome itself. Expecting all of them to share identical clothing preferences was becoming unrealistic. Still, lawmakers tried, restrictions appeared, public pressure increased, traditionalists demanded compliance, but something fascinating happened. The practical advantages of trousers continued accumulating faster than the social penalties attached to them. Every merchant who traveled efficiently, every soldier who stayed warm, every worker who moved comfortably, every traveler who crossed difficult terrain. They were all running the same experiment, and the results were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. This highlights a recurring pattern throughout history. Successful innovations don't necessarily win because they are revolutionary. Often they win because they solve ordinary problems repeatedly, day after day, year after year. Eventually, the accumulated convenience becomes overwhelming. Think about smartphones replacing older devices, or electric lighting replacing candles, or automobiles replacing horses. At first, defenders of tradition always identify flaws, and they're usually right. Early innovations often have serious limitations, but if the benefits consistently outweigh the costs, adoption becomes inevitable. That's what was happening with trousers. They weren't glamorous. They weren't ideological. They were useful, and usefulness has extraordinary staying power. Meanwhile, something else was changing inside Roman society. Younger generations were growing up in a more interconnected world than their ancestors had known. Exposure to foreign cultures was becoming normal. The sharp distinction between Roman and barbarian looked increasingly artificial to people whose daily lives involved interacting with both. Cultural walls that once seemed permanent were becoming porous. The empire still possessed enormous power, but power and influence are not the same thing. Rome could command armies. Rome could collect taxes. Rome could issue decrees. Yet convincing millions of people to reject a practical solution simply because it originated elsewhere was becoming a much harder task. The battle over pants was no longer about clothing. It had become a test of whether authority could stop a cultural shift already underway. While Rome struggled to preserve its cultural boundaries, the eastern half of the empire was quietly conducting a different experiment. And like many historical turning points, it happened so gradually that most people barely noticed. If you had traveled from Rome to Constantinople during the later centuries of the empire, you might have been surprised by how differently people viewed the same issue. In the West, trousers still carried traces of suspicion. In the East, practicality was beginning to win the argument. This wasn't because Eastern Romans were less proud of their heritage, quite the opposite. They simply lived at the crossroads of a much larger world. Everyday merchants arrived from Persia, Armenia, Central Asia, and beyond. Diplomats negotiated treaties. Traders exchanged goods. Ideas flowed alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. Exposure changes perspective. The more cultures you encounter, the harder it becomes to believe your own customs are the only reasonable ones. That lesson slowly reshaped Eastern attitudes. What fascinates me is that clothing often acts as an early warning system for larger social transformations. Long before political maps change, wardrobes start changing. Long before empires split, cultural habits begin drifting apart. The East and West still called themselves Roman, still served the same empire, still honored the same traditions, yet they were increasingly developing different answers to a simple question: should usefulness matter more than symbolism? In Constantinople, many people were beginning to answer yes. The Eastern elite still respected ceremonial dress. They still understood the prestige of Roman traditions, but they were also willing to borrow successful ideas from neighboring cultures. They saw no contradiction in being Roman while adopting practical improvements. The Western elite often viewed the same behavior as dangerous compromise. This difference may seem trivial when discussing clothing, but it reveals something profound about adaptability. Civilizations rarely collapse because they encounter new ideas. More often, they struggle because they lose the ability to distinguish between essential values and temporary habits. Strong societies protect core principles while updating outdated practices. Weak societies treat every custom as sacred and then exhaust themselves defending details that no longer matter. The Eastern Empire increasingly behaved like the first type. The Western Empire increasingly behaved like the second. Of course, history is never that simple. The East faced its own crises, corruption, and political disasters. But when it came to cultural flexibility, the contrast was becoming visible. Even high-ranking officials sometimes appeared in clothing styles that would have shocked earlier generations. What mattered was effectiveness, diplomacy, and status, not strict obedience to ancient dress codes. And this raises a question that extends far beyond Rome. How do we know which traditions deserve preservation and which deserve retirement? Every society struggles with that problem. Change too quickly and you risk losing identity. Refuse to change at all and you risk becoming obsolete. Finding the balance is one of the hardest challenges any civilization faces. Rome was now approaching that challenge at full speed, because events beyond the frontier were gathering momentum. Entire populations were moving. New powers were emerging. Military realities were changing. And soon, debates about clothing would collide with something far more powerful than fashion, law, or cultural pride. They would collide with conquest itself. History books often describe the fall of Rome through dates, battles, and political crises, but there is another way to understand what happened. Sometimes the fastest way to measure a civilization's confidence is to watch what happens when it encounters a successful outsider. Confident societies borrow useful ideas without fear. Insecure societies spend enormous energy proving they don't need them. For centuries, Rome had the luxury of believing it could remain unchanged. Then the 5th century arrived and shattered that illusion. When Germanic kingdoms began establishing themselves inside former Roman territory, the entire conversation about trousers changed overnight. Suddenly, the people Romans had spent generations mocking were no longer distant tribes beyond the frontier. They were rulers, military commanders, landowners, and political power brokers. And power has a remarkable effect on cultural prestige. Consider how quickly human beings reassess ideas once those ideas become associated with success. A custom dismissed as primitive can become fashionable in a single generation if the people practicing it start winning. This happens constantly throughout history. Victorious cultures attract imitation. Defeated cultures inspire nostalgia. Rome discovered this lesson the hard way. The traditional Roman elite faced a dilemma. They could cling to symbols of a world that was disappearing, or they could adapt to the realities of a changing political landscape. Many chose adaptation, not because they suddenly abandoned Roman identity, but because survival tends to outperform pride in the hierarchy of human priorities. If a Germanic king controlled your region, spoke the language of power, commanded the army, and distributed opportunities, dressing like him started looking considerably more reasonable. What fascinates me is how quickly supposedly eternal customs can change when incentives shift. For generations, trousers had represented barbarism. Now they represented authority. The garment itself had not changed. The social meaning attached to it had. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about culture. People often claim to defend principles when they are actually defending status. Once status moves elsewhere, principles frequently follow. Yet there was another factor accelerating the transition. Warfare itself was evolving. Classical Roman military power had been built heavily around disciplined infantry formations. The new political landscape increasingly emphasized cavalry, mobility, and rapid movement across large territories. And here reality delivered another devastating argument against the toga. Riding horses while wrapped in layers of heavy draped fabric is difficult. Fighting while wrapped in that fabric is worse. Surviving while wrapped in that fabric is occasionally hilarious to spectators but generally unfortunate for the rider. Trousers weren't winning because they were fashionable. They were winning because they worked. Better mobility, better protection, better comfort, better practicality. History often rewards boring advantages repeated millions of times. The cumulative effect becomes unstoppable. By this point, the debate was essentially over. Many people simply hadn't realized it yet. The laws still existed. The traditions still existed. The speeches still existed. But beneath the surface, daily life had already moved on. And once daily life moves on, institutions are usually just negotiating the timing of their surrender. By the middle of the 5th century, something remarkable had happened. The Romans had not officially declared defeat in their war against Pants. There was no grand ceremony. No emperor stood before the Senate and announced, "It turns out the barbarians were right." History almost never works that way. Instead, the defeat arrived through 1,000 ordinary decisions made by ordinary people. A merchant chose comfort over tradition. A soldier chose warmth over symbolism. A traveler chose practicality over appearances. One choice meant nothing. Millions of choices changed civilization. And that may be the most important lesson hidden inside this entire story. We often imagine history being shaped by great men, decisive battles, and dramatic speeches. Those events matter, certainly. But cultural transformation usually happens much more quietly. It happens when enough people stop believing the old rules make sense. Once that threshold is crossed, laws become decorations, customs become memories, traditions become museum exhibits. The toga was now approaching that fate. For nearly 8 centuries, it had functioned as one of the most recognizable symbols in the ancient world. Entire generations had grown up believing that Roman civilization itself was wrapped inside its folds, yet the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The empire's economy was changing. Its military was changing. Its population was changing. Its political structure was changing. The clothing that once reflected Roman life no longer reflected Roman life. What fascinates me is how human beings respond when a symbol outlives its original purpose. Some people let it go. Others fight desperately to preserve it. We see this pattern everywhere. Old technologies, old institutions, old social norms. Sometimes they disappear because they fail. Other times they disappear because the world around them changes. The toga belonged to the second category. It hadn't suddenly become worse. Rome had simply become different. Yet even as daily use declined, the toga retained enormous emotional power. That's because symbols rarely vanish completely. They evolve. They migrate into new roles. They survive in rituals long after they disappear from practical life. Think about modern neckties. They serve almost no practical purpose. Yet millions of people still wear them in situations where symbolism matters. Weddings, business meetings, ceremonies. Why? Because clothing communicates identity. The same thing happened with the toga. It slowly retreated from ordinary life into ceremonial life. Public officials still wore versions of it. Important events still featured it. Artists still depicted it. The garment was becoming less like clothing and more like a memory. And memories are powerful things. They allow societies to maintain continuity even while everything else changes. Yet there is an irony here that would probably make an ancient Roman senator deeply uncomfortable. The people who ultimately preserved elements of Roman dress were often the very groups Rome would never have expected. Not senators, not generals, not emperors, but religious institutions, scholars, and ceremonial traditions that carried fragments of the old world into entirely new eras. The toga was dying as everyday clothing, but it was preparing for an afterlife far longer than anyone living in Rome could have imagined. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Rome, bigger than pants, and even bigger than fashion itself. Because what survived after the empire collapsed was not merely a piece of clothing. It was a lesson about how civilizations adapt, resist, and reinvent themselves. By the 6th century, the world that had created the toga was largely gone. The Senate that once obsessed over proper Roman dress had lost most of its power. The emperors who issued decrees about identity had vanished from the Western stage. The political machine that spent centuries defining who counted as civilized no longer existed. Yet somehow pieces of Roman culture endured, not through military conquest, not through legal authority, through symbolism. Human beings have always been storytellers, and clothing often becomes part of those stories. Medieval kings wanted to appear connected to the prestige of Rome, so they adopted ceremonial garments that echoed Roman drapery. Church leaders inherited visual traditions because religious institutions excel at preserving continuity. Universities later developed robes that communicated learning, authority, and distinction in ways surprisingly similar to ancient Roman formal dress. In other words, the toga lost the practical war but won the symbolic one. And that outcome is strangely poetic. The garment designed to separate Romans from everyone else eventually became part of a shared cultural inheritance reaching far beyond Rome itself. Meanwhile, the so-called barbarian trousers completed the opposite journey. They began as a symbol of outsiders, then they became military equipment, then everyday clothing. Eventually they became so normal that nobody thought about them anymore. That's often the final stage of a successful innovation, not becoming admired but becoming invisible. We don't wake up every morning celebrating the invention of buttons, zippers, or shoes. We simply use them. Victory becomes ordinary. What fascinates me is how many modern debates follow the same pattern. New technologies arrive. New social habits emerge. New ideas challenge existing norms. People divide into camps. One side sees progress. The other sees decline. Both sides claim history is on their side. Yet decades later, most people can barely remember why the argument seemed so important. The Romans spent centuries treating trousers as a civilizational threat. Today nobody associates pants with barbarism. The fear vanished because the reality never matched the anxiety. That doesn't mean every new idea is good. History offers plenty of examples where skepticism proved justified. But it does suggest that societies should be careful about confusing unfamiliarity with danger. Sometimes the future arrives wearing clothing we don't recognize. Sometimes useful ideas come from places we look down on. Sometimes the people we dismiss end up teaching us something valuable. Rome's greatest mistake wasn't having pants. Its greatest mistake was assuming wisdom could only come from Rome. Once a civilization starts believing that, it stops learning. And when learning stops, decline is rarely far behind. The most successful societies in history are not those that never change. They are the ones confident enough to borrow good ideas regardless of where those ideas originate. Rome's story is not a warning about fashion. It is a warning about arrogance disguised as tradition. So here we are, standing at the end of a story that began with a simple question about clothing and ended with a lesson about civilization itself. The Romans spent nearly 8 centuries insisting that trousers represented everything they were not: foreignness, barbarism, inferiority. Yet today, almost every person on earth is living proof that they lost that argument. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that most people wearing pants have absolutely no idea they are participating in one of history's oldest cultural victories. The barbarians never needed to convince Rome they were right. They simply needed their solution to work better. That distinction matters because it reveals a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Reality is patient. Practicality is patient. Useful ideas don't always win immediately. Sometimes they lose elections. Sometimes they lose arguments. Sometimes they spend generations being mocked by powerful people. but if they consistently solve real problems, they tend to survive long enough for history to reconsider them. The Roman debate over pants is ultimately a case study in the limits of cultural certainty. Rome was not foolish because it valued tradition. Every successful civilization values tradition. Rome became vulnerable when it started treating tradition as evidence of superiority rather than as a tool that should occasionally be reevaluated. There is a profound difference between respecting the past and being imprisoned by it. The Romans who adapted understood that difference. The soldiers freezing on distant frontiers understood it. The merchants traveling across continents understood it. The Eastern administrators negotiating with foreign powers understood it. They recognized that preserving a civilization does not mean preserving every habit unchanged. It means preserving the ability to learn. And perhaps that is why this story feels surprisingly modern. Today we live in a world filled with our own versions of the pants debate. Technologies that some people celebrate and others fear. Social changes that divide generations. New ideas arriving from unexpected places. Every society faces moments when it must decide whether identity is strong enough to evolve or so fragile that it must resist everything unfamiliar. The Romans made both choices at different times, and history rewarded one far more generously than the other. What's truly remarkable is that the toga never completely disappeared, and the trousers never completely conquered. Instead, each found its proper place. Trousers became practical everyday wear because they solved practical everyday problems. Roman ceremonial clothing survived in churches, universities, courts, and graduations because symbols still matter. Human beings need both function and meaning. We need clothing that works and stories that connect us to something larger than ourselves. The real victory was never one garment defeating another. The real victory was adaptation finding a way to coexist with memory. Takeaway. The lesson of Rome's war against pants is not that tradition is useless or that change is always good. The lesson is that strong societies know the difference between their core values and their old habits. When civilizations confuse the two, they end up fighting reality. And reality, eventually, wins every time.